Hi, I'm Hannah,
And I'm Lydia.
and we are a pair of bookends.
And we were just hoping that we could interrupt this episode to ask you very kindly if you would sign up to our Patreon.
Yes, if you have some spare change rattling around in your pocket, we would so appreciate it if you could go over to patreon.com/a pair of bookends where you can support our work. We have been doing this podcast for nearly 2 years now, and we wanted the opportunity to get to know some of you a little better. And via our Patreon, as well as getting exclusive benefits, you can also have the opportunity to share your own recommendations with us and to chat with us. And it's just a nice place for us to have our own little hub.
For less than the price of a coffee, you can get exclusive Patreon-only benefits, such as our Patreon exclusive book club, where you get to pick the book that we read each month, and also
early access to all podcast episodes,
and your chance to ask our authors your own questions.
So please do, if you can, sign up to our Patreon via patreon.com/a pair of bookends and support our work. We would appreciate it more than you can imagine, and it helps us hugely to bring you all the extra special stuff.
So come and officially become a bookend.
Now on to today's episode. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. Welcome to another episode of Bonus Books, where we choose the books we think should be put firmly on your radar. Today we are chatting about Body Friend, a poetic and beautiful novel about the relationship between body and self. We follow three women as they come to terms with living with illness and grapple with recovery. A truly remarkable piece of new fiction that we are sure is going to have lasting impact.
Katherine Brabon is a writer based in Naarm, Melbourne. She's the author of 3 novels, the first of which, The Memory Artist, won the Australian Vogels Literary Award in 2016. It was shortlisted in the NSW Premiers Literary Awards and longlisted in the Indie Book Awards. Her second novel, The Shut-Ins, published in 2021, won the People's Choice Award at the New South Wales Premiers Literary Awards. It was also shortlisted for the Christina Stead Prize for Fiction and longlisted for the Voss Prize and the ALS Gold Medal. Her work has appeared in Vogue, Australian Book Review and the Sydney Morning Herald, amongst other publications, and she is a regular contributor to Melbourne's Lindsay magazine. Her latest novel, Body Friend, was released in Australia in August 2023 and was published by Ultimo Press in the UK in January this year. We are so thrilled to have Katherine herself joining us today. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here.
It's so nice to have you.
When I say that I absolutely devoured this book, I mean I devoured this book. And I don't know whether it can be slightly insulting for an author when you're like, I read it in like a few hours. And you're like, it took me a long time to write.
No, I feel like that's a really nice thing for me as an author to hear, because I know that feeling myself when you get so drawn into a book. And it's harder these days, I think, to have that kind of attention.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I love hearing that.
But before we do delve into the book, which I'm very excited about talking about, can we ask you what you are currently reading?
Yes, sure. Well, I'm currently traveling and I'm very excited to be in the UK at the moment launching this book. And I, of course, had all these grand plans to do heaps of reading in cafes and on trains while I've been here. I think I've read like 10 pages the whole 2 weeks. But I did, when I was here in London, buy a copy of Kate Briggs' The Long Fawn, which is a beautiful novel out through Fitzcarraldo. And I'm just starting it, but it's about motherhood but also creative practice, and at the moment it's just these beautiful kind of 1-page or sometimes 1-paragraph little snippets of this writer and mother and her daily life with a child, but I know that it's sort of threaded with reflections on the art of translation, which is something Briggs does. And it's a book I've heard mentioned a lot, and I like to kind of keep a book on my radar to buy when I'm overseas. It's just so nice to go into bookshops and buy them. So I got that one at a beautiful little bookshop, Pages of Hackney, in London. And yeah, so I know that when I get home, I'll dive further into it. But it's funny how when you travel, yeah, the days end up being really, really busy and long, and you don't get around to reading as much as I'd like to.
So is that the only book that you've bought whilst you've been here?
No.
Oh, I was gonna say, like,
I was like,
that is good going. Like, I
I
admire
know.
that.
No, you're so right. What else have I bought? I bought The Shining by Jon Fosse, the
oh yes.
Norwegian Nobel Prize winner. And when my partner teased me for buying another book, it's tiny, this one. It's like a
It's
pamphlet or something. I was like, it's
tiny.
barely a book. And then I bought a Natalia Ginsburg as well, from the lovely little bookshop Review bookshop in Peckham, which I'm really looking forward to. I've blanked on the title of that now, but I feel like her books are one that's on my radar as well. So I think that's all. I think I almost bought one again today, but I'm trying to tell myself to not buy too many. But I think I've got 3 books to take home with me, which is nice.
I think if I went out, if we did a swap and I went out to Australia, I think I would have to take an empty suitcase with me because there's so many books that I hear about in Australia that aren't out yet here,
Yes.
and I just get so like jealous. So I
Do the
think I would
back
just
of the
come and
bag, yeah, with the publication. And there's some amazing Australian novelists who are, the greats like, Helen Garner and, Jared Monane, who are having this real, like, I don't know, I was going to say renaissance, but they haven't really had their time overseas, like the UK and the
yeah,
US.
we're about
Now,
to get Helen Garner, aren't we?
that's amazing. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I've
I'm
I've
so
heard this
excited
recently.
for
We're about to
readers.
get.
Yeah, I just feel like and in the US as well, I think they're getting reviewed. And Alexis Wright as well is now getting published in America. So yeah, I feel like it's great that these authors are getting published, but it astounds me that they're not already published overseas.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
incredible. There was like Diana Reid. I heard so
yes,
many things about her for ages, and then I was literally like reading people's reviews on Instagram and being like, "Oh my gosh, this sounds amazing!" And then I'd go to look for it, and then we didn't have it. And then finally, I think we got both of her books within within 1 year. I don't know if it was last year or the year before,
oh,
but we got her
amazing,
book,
yeah.
like both of her books within the space of like 6 months.
Yes,
Um,
that's a nice sort of, I guess, effect of that. It means that you can sort of like binge read one author if all their books come
yeah,
out at a similar
exactly.
time. Yeah.
Now we need to we've started gushing about other books, but we need to gush over your book. That's important. So I would love to start on Body Friend by asking about the inspiration behind it. So could you tell us what inspired this story and how what was the writing process like for you?
Yeah, sure. So my first 2 books were very different for me in that they were really inspired by my research. I was studying like history and other cultures, and my first book was set in Russia in like the 20th century. My second was set in Japan. They were countries I'd sort of traveled to and researched. And I remember sort of saying to a friend when I was just starting to write and in my 20s that I didn't think I'd ever write about anything too personal. I think maybe it's just me being naive, thinking, "Oh no, this is I like to write about other places and what I've researched." But then, I guess 10 years later, I felt like I wanted, or maybe I was ready to write something a bit more personal. And so this book, as you said, is a lot about chronic illness in women's bodies. And I've had chronic illness since I was in my early 20s. I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and another kind of arthritis that sort of affects the spine. And so I've had chronic pain for a long time, sort of, over 15 years, I suppose. And it's something that I have come to know so well as like a state of being. And I sort of realized that, the consciousness of pain and how it impacts the way you see the world is really something that a writer can potentially attempt to convey, because we're always trying to convey as a writer, whether it's a character's consciousness and day-to-day experience. And with illness, I realized, well, I do have this window to the world but others maybe one don't have but could benefit from understanding, or others do have and maybe don't see represented as much as it's sort of a first person narrative in fiction. And so that was sort of, I guess, the maybe some of the reasoning that drove me to attempt to write something about illness, but I really wasn't sure where I would start with it. And I started with a short story a number of years ago, and just sort of, often send things off to magazines and competitions and hear nothing. But this one story I sent off about a woman with a chronic illness did end up winning a prize and getting published. And I was like, oh, maybe this is sort of not that I always need external validation, but I think when it was something so personal and so close to me, I think for some reason I did need to send it out and have a response that was encouraging in order to keep going. And so with that done, I then sort of turned to the attempt to write a novel that was, I knew I wanted it to be fiction, but I wanted it to be, I got really interested in sort of a fiction that was aligned quite closely with my own experience, and then with character, still all the literary devices that I enjoy kind of using. So yeah, with this book, I guess a very slow process to come to terms with trying to write something like this. But then with the actual writing process, I guess it wasn't in a sense easy, but easier in some ways in that there wasn't the heavy research involved in my other books. But it was I liked the process of just drawing from my own thoughts and learnings and trying to think, well, what has this experience of chronic pain and illness kind of taught me in a sense, and what do I want to convey? And then all those difficulties came up of like, it is actually quite hard you can say you're in pain, but the difficulty of actually wording it was something that, again, for a writer is super interesting. Like these questions of sort of unspeakable things like trauma that have always interested me, and how do you convey that in a work without just sort of saying, I am in pain. It's to convey the experience, the day-to-day life of being in pain was something that was a good, I guess, challenge to kind of find a form for. So yeah, like a slow process, and then but it feels good to kind of have attempted to do this kind of novel.
I mean, it's such a fascinating subject, chronic pain, and the way that you write about it is so interesting, because it forms very much the crux of the narrative throughout the whole of the book, and at times you even write how words just fail sometimes they just fail at certain points with pain. You just cannot describe it. I mean, anyone that's had a child and given birth will know that you can never fully convey what that pain felt like to somebody else.
Absolutely.
And that's, for a very short amount of time, and you do
Yeah.
get a baby at the end of it.
Yes.
So, it's not living with the pain, but it's, that's all I can compare it to personally. But again, trying to explain that is so hard. What was it like trying to translate your experience of chronic pain into the book? Because I imagine that it was quite a difficult process.
Yeah, you're so right. There's sort of the sense that the narrator does feel that, she can maybe describe on like a scale of, 1 to 10, but then that doesn't really get through. And I think particularly in intimate relationships as well, and with family or partners, it's very kind of difficult to sort of explain what it's like, just in a day-to-day level. So I think I was interested to find ways of conveying more the thought processes and the habits and the ways of moving through the world. And I think for somebody with a chronic illness or chronic pain, the way you see space, I guess, changes. Being back in the UK where I've lived before, it's really interesting because when I lived here, I was in a big flare of pain, and just even being sort of in spaces I've been before and thinking, oh, this distance used to be so much bigger to me, or this particular staircase in this cafe I used to go to a lot. I notice now that the illness is a lot better controlled. I'm seeing those spaces differently because I feel a little bit more able to do things. But to convey that in a book, it's maybe trying to convey how the narrator sees the world in a kind of a day-to-day experience. And I guess like recognizing that there are those kinds of, like you were saying with childbirth, there are those sorts of like silences almost, like we can convey that it is painful, but then there's just this gap in, I guess, conveying of that. And that it just sort of is, it is part of it. So I think drawing on those kinds of techniques, and I think maybe with Body Friend, with the characters that the narrator meets. So she meets Frida at the pool, who really hopes that she can control her illness, and by swimming and by kind of having a bit of a, I guess, a tougher attitude to her pain. Where she also meets Sylvia in the park, and Sylvia very much wants to kind of not necessarily embrace the pain, but embrace the concept of resting and knowing that that's what the body needs sometimes. And I think for a narrator to be torn between those two states is another kind of way of conveying that experience of chronic illness as well, where the states aren't really static or predictable. You can feel very much like those two different people in a single day or a single hour. You can have a great week, and you can, it can be quite frustrating to try and track the cause of those particularly good or bad days, and it's not always intelligible. So yeah, I guess was like interesting for me to use those techniques as a way to kind of convey it's almost like the state of being in pain rather than the pain itself, and hoping that as a kind of, it creates a bit of an atmosphere, I suppose. And for that reason, and the first person perspective seemed to work quite well, but it's quite an intense perspective to be in for a reader. So I think, which I knew might happen, and the repetitions of back and forth between the two women, but I wanted to really put the reader into that, because I thought, I could make sections shorter or have less repetition, but then it's not really conveying what it's really like. Almost like the reader, it's an interesting question for me, like if a reader gets bored by the back and forth between the two women, is that a good thing because it really conveys what illness is like, or is that bad because I haven't edited it out? But I find those artistic questions really kind of fascinating too, and all of those things were sort of brought up by trying to write about pain.
Yeah, I think you translated that experience to the page so well. One of my closest friends lives with a chronic illness, and I was speaking to her after I finished reading your book, and I just sent her a picture, and I was like, I need to lend you this book, like ASAP. And obviously I hear through her experiences and how she's feeling and what the pain's like for her, but it's a very different experience to read from inside somebody's mind, if that makes sense. It was a very, very different experience to read as though I'm living alongside that person rather than just hearing through my friend, if that made sense. So it helped me gain a much better understanding of what it's like for her. And I messaged her and said that, that it gave me this great understanding. It helped me understand her need to control certain situations, because you write a lot about safety and needing the need to feel safe in certain spaces. And I asked her, what that was like for her. And it made me think, because I always thought I'd been such a supportive friend. I thought I'd kind of supported her well and been there for her. But then I was thinking back, and there was a time when I said to her one day, like, why do you always choose where we go? Like, I want to be able to choose for once. And then I read this book and thought back to that conversation, and I thought, oh my God, what a bitch. Like, why would I say that to her? Like, it's quite obvious to me now that the reason why she always needed to choose where we went was because it was a safety thing. It was where, it was something that she needed the space to be able to accommodate her and her needs. And I'd never taken that into consideration. I was just like, why do you always need to choose where we go? Why can't I say where I want to go?
That's really interesting to hear. And so I'm so sort of happy to hear that it's given you that kind of insight, because they're not immediately apparent, those sort of behaviors as to why. And I think I've got something similar in the book where the narrator kind of always likes to walk home the same way every time.
That's what made me think of it.
Yeah, her partner's like the opposite and loves to kind of find a road that they haven't walked down before, or let's just see where this leads. And the narrator's instantly thinking, I don't know how much extra walking that's going to be. Is there going to be a dead end? We have to turn around. And it comes across as really kind of unspontaneous and predictable. But then, viewed from that other side, the reasoning's there. But I think that's great if the book can sort of prompt that thinking or that conversation about those sort of needs, because it's access, but it's a different kind of access, because it's
Absolutely.
more about kind of the the mental load of preparing to go somewhere on a bad day, or that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm really pleased to hear that
No,
is.
thank you. It was a real, like, moment of realization for me. And it was that exact moment that you're speaking about in the book where they're on that walk together that I had that realization. So yeah, I'm really grateful that you've written this. And I really cannot recommend this to our listeners enough. I feel like more people need to read this and have a better understanding of what it's like living with chronic pain and chronic illness. I think you've written about it so well. And one thing I did want to speak about is you were just talking about space and space in relation to safety, like we were just talking about then. But the world that your protagonist inhabits is quite small. She essentially goes from home. It's like the hospital, home, the pool and the park, and it's kind of going from one to the other, and it creates this quite claustrophobic feeling. I mean, I was talking to Lydia the other day and I couldn't quite figure out what word it was I was looking for, but it does have that sense of claustrophobia, as though she's almost sort of not trapped, but kind of trapped as well. Was this a conscious choice for you to have this quite small world that she inhabits, and where did this choice come from?
No, I love that as an observation, because it is something that was a choice the further I got into the writing, because I think I had the option of bringing in other characters and, the workplace or family or things like that. But I decided at some point that it needed to be quite a contained narrative, and a very contained narrative, really. As you say, it's such a small sort of geographical and relational space in terms of how many people are even in the book. It does give it that kind of pressurized environment. I think there were a few reasons. One is that the narrator has recently had surgery, and so she's sort of in this recovery period of, she's not better, but she's had joint replacement surgery that will hopefully alleviate some of her pain. And then she's on leave from her studies for that period of time as well. So that was a reason for sort of trying to maybe dramatize the process of recovery, and also just the process of an intense period of illness and pain in the book. But I also think it probably gets to something that we were talking about before, about the kind of the closeness of the narrative in the conveying of like just a consciousness of one narrator constantly in her body and mind and thinking about things, was a kind of I could achieve that maybe by really tightening and containing the narrative, and then I guess using the two women, Frida and Sylvia, in a way that it almost feels like they're the only real part of her life in this stage of the book, and it does make us go back and forth between them constantly. And I made the decision that the narrator's partner, who's sort of the other only main character in the book, doesn't meet the two women, because I wanted it really to circle around the narrator with those three kind of relationships, with herself, with the two women, and not spread out any further. And I'm happy I've heard it's really interesting hearing readers' responses, and some are sort of wondering, oh, are they even real because nobody else meets them, or are they actually friends that she just doesn't see again, or something like that. And I'm quite happy for readers to take what they will from that. But I think it was a way to convey the intensity of that back and forth illness experience, and also maybe, I guess it was quite a conscious decision, as we were saying before, for the book to be solely about illness. I think we have, I've read other books where a character does have an illness and it's part of the narrative maybe. And obviously I feel like that representation is really important. If the illness is sort of a tangent to the main narrative, or part of it, or the narrator just happens to have an illness, or a character just happens to have an illness. But this was quite a conscious decision to make illness the narrative, and make it the plot, and make it the technique and the form, and make illness sort of the whole experience of the book, which I felt like was maybe a point of difference I could try to offer. It wasn't tangential to the plot, it was sort of the main thing. And so I think containing it and making it quite pressurized and potentially quite an intense reading experience, but with the view of really conveying, and like you were saying before, putting the reader through that quite claustrophobic experience, I hope brings out that impact that I wanted it to have.
I'm so glad that you were like, some people think that they're not real, because I was so convinced that they were not real. I was like, they don't meet anyone. I was like, I'm putting this together, like Sherlock Holmes. But it was.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, it's for the reader, I feel. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
out there. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's because I think in some respects, you could see them as coping mechanisms. You can see them as reflections of herself. But I think that it's very interesting. It's very interesting to see the people that think that they're real and the people that think that they're not. It's really, really good. One of the things that I really loved about the book was the use of Sylvia Plath's work in Plaster, which if our bookends at home haven't read, just go and give it a quick Google and give it a read because it's a brilliant, brilliant piece. Our protagonist, she's very much kind of apart from herself and yet completely intertwined with her own sense of identity. She's kind of like diametrically opposed in so many ways. What was it like trying to create her persona? Like, because she's so well crafted, but there is so much to her at the same time.
I love that you've brought up the Plath poem because I read that and I just, I found it so, so powerful. Just sort of this woman lying in bed in plaster, and the plaster is taking on an identity and it wants to be its own self. And to me, it really resonated, I think, with just the kind of a confusion of identity that comes with a chronic illness and its changeable nature, I suppose. Even just in my own experience, there's just certain days where, if you're having a good few days, you feel, you do feel a bit like a different version of yourself, even just more maybe connected to the world, or even if it's just because you're feeling a bit happier, you're feeling much more capable of doing things. And then a bad day comes along and you think, oh, who on earth, was that person the other day who felt so confident to do something. Sometimes that thing is even just kind of a phone call or a shower or going out to see a friend or things like that. And I think it's such a interesting complexity for me. And identity is something that's always really interested me as a subject in fiction, and just in general, how the dynamic in a group, in a room with one other person. I'm always fascinated by, even myself, how I feel with just like one-on-one with a friend versus like when there's suddenly like 4 people or suddenly 8 people or something, and just how it makes you feel so different in terms of maybe what you want to even say or do or be versus like a bigger group scenario. And so that is a way of, feeling like a different version of yourself is out there, or is that you are trying to sort of present. When it comes to illness as well, I feel like those questions are even more shaped by that illness experience, like going even with the doctor, you're suddenly kind of maybe not quite the expert in your particular illness, but you're the expert in your own experience. And so writing felt quite interesting in that sense, because I did feel like I had a certain sense of, authority that I couldn't get through, maybe research, but you get through lived experience. But then you go to see various healthcare professionals who have a different way of knowing your illness, and therefore you. And so, dramatizing all of that through the narrator's kind of experience with Frida and Sylvia was kind of a way of getting at that. But I feel like the double in literature has always interested me, that kind of character, the foil character they call it, who like reflects a self of you, a version of you back on yourself, interests me. Like I feel like Plath does use that, and Elena Ferrante uses the foil of kind of an opposite. So doubles in literature are so often like a complete opposite, I suppose, like your Jekyll and Hyde. Whereas I was interested in kind of complicating that a bit with, it's almost like a tripling going on with the 3 women. And I feel like there could have even been more in a sense, or there are more probably floating around in there of the blurring between them, because I think, it's never fixed. And I think it's one of the real difficulties with chronic illness, I think, is that it never is, as I said before, fixed or predictable. And so your identity and how you maybe feel as somebody with an illness, even sometimes when I'm quite in control of the illness in terms of medication and things, I feel like not right asking for, like identifying as somebody with an illness, or a disability because of a chronic illness. And it's interesting, it's a label that should be helpful and should be kind of something that you take on, and then that's if you've identified with it, that's fine. But it's interesting to me even now. I feel yeah, if I'm feeling okay, I feel like, oh, I shouldn't say that because it's a good day. And it just that complicated nature of identity is something that, yeah, I've been really interested to explore. And that poem does something beautiful in that subject as well.
Yeah, and I love the sense it brings of kind of like feeling like almost like a doppelganger. You know, when
Yeah.
you look at a doppelganger but they're you, but they're not quite you. The nose is off, or their eyes aren't
Yeah.
right, or there's just
Yeah.
something that makes you feel. And I love the way that our protagonist talks about, Frida and Sylvia, and that, she looks exactly like me from the back, you
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
same color hair, but but from the
And
side
it's not
profile.
quite. Yeah. Yeah.
I find that absolutely fascinating. I really do.
No,
Yeah.
that's so interesting to hear. And yeah, it's got a surreal sort of feeling, I think. That's what I like with that doppelganger feeling as well. It's sort of there's a slight unease to it, which I think feels quite authentic.
I really want to talk about the protagonist and her relationship with how you say his name? Is it Thomas? Thomas?
Tomasz in
Tomasz.
what was his name? Tomasz.
Tomasz.
But yeah, Thomas is also fine.
Is Tomasz Polish?
Yes, it
Yes,
is a
okay.
Polish name. Yeah.
Tomasz. Okay, so I really wanted to talk about the protagonist and her relationship with Tomasz. It feels like it's a hard dynamic to describe because it feels like this really gentle, loving, kind relationship, and he seems like a really good man, and he really wants to support her and take care of her and kind of do right by her. But there also feels like this sort of undercurrent throughout that is like this resentment on both sides. You kind of get this sense that he's resenting her for not going out, and you also get the sense that she's resenting him for even asking her to go out because she's in recovery. Why on earth would she be going out? And so there's this kind of undercurrent of this push and pull dynamic between them both, which is, as I said, it's very under the surface and you never quite explicitly say it. What were you trying to sort of capture by creating their dynamic?
Yeah, I think to me that relationship was a really interesting one to kind of include because, like I was saying before, we were talking about how it's such a contained narrative, and there really is just the narrator, Frida and Sylvia, in this like enclosed space, and then Tomasz is her partner, and he's almost like the other side that's like encouraging her and drawing her out back into the world in a way post recovery. But as you say, yes, there is this kind of undercurrent of almost misunderstanding sometimes. And I guess I wanted to have that element of the chronic illness experience of just that, I guess, that relational aspect of what it's like to try and negotiate that with someone you're very close to, someone who is very understanding and a partner. But also, again, those chasms of, I guess, dialogue and language that can happen, like when we talked about the difficulty of describing pain. And then this is kind of amplifying that and dramatizing it in a relationship context. So how do you sort of deal with being in a relationship while you've got a chronic illness, and then how a partner can be really understanding. But then I'm so interested to explore kind of the limits of empathy and sympathy, because they're very strong and powerful feelings, but at the end of the day, nobody can quite be in your body, and that's why the bodily experience is such a singular one. They can never quite understand like why your mood has suddenly shifted or why you suddenly don't want to do something. I think eventually those things become apparent. Maybe, oh, that's because of this, the person's now in more pain, or something's going on with their body. But to try and show how that repetition happens in a day-to-day relationship, just like in any relationship, there's so many things that we do and don't say, or can and can't say, and then when you throw it on a chronic illness into that as well, it just adds to that complexity. And so the narrator's partner is kind of encouraging her to sort of come out, because he thinks that he doesn't want to appear as though he's sort of assuming she never wants to, and wants to kind of offer that experience for her to come out for a drink. But then, as you say, the narrator kind of wants to be asked to come, but also wants to have that understanding that she may not be able to. And it's it's so difficult, I guess, because she kind of wants both. She doesn't want to come out, but she does. And it's that fraught kind of push-pull of being unwell and knowing that your body maybe doesn't allow you to do something that you as a person want to do. And then the difficulty of your partner understanding that, as a person you want to, but your body doesn't really want to, and that difficulty of that, and just how that plays out with like the simplest thing, like, going out for a coffee, meeting after work, all of those things just take on this kind of complex nature. And I think, it was an interesting one to write, sort of as a way of pulling the narrator slightly out of the intense Frida Sylvia circle that she's going in, the cyclical nature of her illness versus like what it is like speaking with others. And I did want to have some of that in the book. Like, she has a couple of encounters with, healthcare professionals as well. But I liked having a relationship there as a way of sort of showing how the tensions do play out, and something like an intimate relationship.
I really loved the way that you wrote those characters, and I thought that the relationship was so nuanced. And I think, there's a real temptation now with the way that we sort of live online in, wanting to label something wholly bad and wholly good. And I think some readers might read Tomasz and be like, oh, like, why is he kind of leaving her on her own? But like you said, like, there's limits to these things, and he also does have to think about himself. He's a human being himself and has his own needs that he needs to see to. He might just really need to go out and be with his friends, and that might be what brings him joy and what fills him up. But for her, that's not what she needs. So I just think I really loved the nuances of that, and the way that you wrote sort of all the different facets of their relationships, and how, you wrote such well-rounded characters. And I think, that's really important that we read that.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. And I think you make a great point about sort of not having just a good and bad character. And I hoped that Frida and Sylvia had that feeling as well, because it is easy, I think, to, you're looking for those cues to go, oh, this character bad, this character
Yes,
good.
yeah.
I think it's more, it just feels so much more life-like,
Exactly.
so much real, to just have that human complexity, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I mean, Sylvia and Frida are both like such fascinating characters, and I loved how much the other women, the two women, reflected our protagonist so well. But I really love the fact that there's moments where the protagonist literally wants to like grab either Sylvia or Frida, and he's like, you know me, you get me, you know me so well. And there's this intensity of this recognition of herself in other people that's so fascinating. And I think part of the reason for that is because I think that female friendships can be so intense, and there is this kind of level of intensity that I think you can only really find in this kind of female friendship. So is that a topic that interested you?
Yeah, interesting. Great question. I feel like it wasn't something that I intentionally set out to write about, female friendship in particular, but by nature of these characters, it just became something that I thought about. And as I was writing, I think I did think back to female friendships. And I think particularly when you're younger, the teen years in particular, when you almost are looking for models or doubles or something, because you're sort of working out who you are and how you want to be, or that sort of thing, and trying to maybe find, that saying of, finding yourself, but finding kind of, your identity and feel. I feel like there's a lot of that mirroring in younger years, and even in early 20s and that sort of thing. So I think that did interest me, and that intensity of it. And now, it makes me think more. And even like I think I thought a lot about the sister relationship too, because I've got two sisters who I'm really, really close to. So I think that kind of feeling of another sort of being so alike you, or, making you know yourself a bit better, really interested me as well. So Frida and Sylvia took on quite early on, I think, like a sister / best friend kind of intensity in sort of the honesty and the way they talk to each other and the dialogue. And I think the dialogue is something that maybe reflected that closeness of the, potential female friendships. And I think I was quite conscious, or, even after I've just been thinking about the book when it's been published and talking about it, I've noted how the dialogue is maybe not necessarily like authentic dialogue, in the sense of some writers write this, amazing dialogue that you feel like you're hearing it, in the sense of like a Sally Rooney or someone you reading dialogue. Whereas like the author Jon Fosse I mentioned earlier, his dialogue is almost like a bit dreamlike, like characters sort of say something and then say the same thing back to them. And I realized in, just in reflection on post publication, that I was interested in that more like dialogue of the dream world and the interior world, because the way we speak to ourselves is maybe more like how we speak to someone we are super, super close to, or maybe just to nobody, just to ourselves, or the way people might speak in dreams, which has that surreal kind of quality. And I've noticed, that's sort of what I was doing there. And that comes from that kind of, closeness of those relationships, I think. And so the dialogue might feel like, strangely repetitive, or almost like a play or song-like or something like that. But I feel like, I'm actually more interested now in the ways dialogue can be used in different ways in fiction. And that was something that came out of those friendships, I think.
I love that you talk about the kind of like inspiration being almost like teen-like, because there are moments where our protagonist, she kind of goes, I knew she'd be upset if I mentioned my other friend, but I'm going to do it anyway to make her a little bit jealous.
Yeah.
And it's such like a kind of like schoolgirl kind of tactic, but I loved it. It was brilliant. It brought a real kind of like authenticity to their relationship.
Good. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad to hear. Yeah. Those fraught relationships.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed as well the parallels between, like you said, the interior world and her dynamic with these two women. And I feel like I can't remember which way around it was. I think Frida is the one that believes that the more they exercise, is that the right way around? Yeah. So Frida is the character that believes in, like, she goes to the pool all the time, and that's where she meets her, and she's constantly saying, like, you need to come to the pool, like, you need to be swimming, you need to be exercising, like, you need to push yourself and, override those feelings of, no, I need to rest. And then Sylvia is like, no, the complete opposite. No, you need to rest. You need to allow your body that time to rest. And I thought it was so interesting because it is the dialogue that we often have with ourselves of, like, whether it's okay or not to rest, and whether we should be pushing ourselves. So I thought it was so interesting to kind of think of that in terms of the interior world and her dynamic with them. And I mean, this is, I've had those feelings myself, and I'm not somebody living with a chronic illness. So I imagine that for a person living with a chronic illness, that's just that feeling times 10 or 100. I don't know.
Yeah, you're so right that it is just it's a human feeling. I think that we've really complicated rest, I think, as a species. Us humans,
we really have.
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of, something that we feel it's associated with kind of luxury or indulgence. And I think particularly maybe with it being something that feels like you have to go out to, I don't know, to do, it's a bit commodified now, I suppose, that idea of like, taking that time. But even when I think the narrator sort of mentions something like this in the book, where, you just hear the word like self-care or rest said so many times that it kind of becomes this thing you feel pressured to do almost. It's almost like something on your list to tick off, whereas sort of maybe following just the rhythm of what your body needs that day, it might need more rest one day that you haven't scheduled, but it needs that kind of rest. And I think there's this sort of focus on productivity and associating a good day with a day that you get heaps done, and that you glorifying like overworking and those sorts of things. Something that impacts everyone. And then when there's chronic illness involved, that that need for that rest time, and often you hear it called crip time, that sort of time needed to recover and just to feel energized enough to do something else is something that needs to be much more of a conversation, just to kind of normalize rest as part of a day, and not have it as something that is guilty, because I think the narrator talks about guilt a lot and control, which we've mentioned, and she really does constantly struggle with that, and she feels like maybe Frida's the better one because she doesn't value rest as much. But then I hope that the audience would think that yes, maybe Sylvia is sort of conveyed a bit as the maybe the slightly not the bad one, but just in a negative light, mainly because the narrator's reading that as like, oh, I shouldn't be resting, and hopefully the novel encourages a bit more of a zooming out and seeing, oh, that's the narrator is perceiving that because she's conditioned to think that rest is not so good, and that maybe Sylvia is a slightly lazier one, whereas that's part of that narrative that she's learnt. And I'm glad that it sort of starts that kind of conversation, the book, so that it can be something that's sort of a bit more understood. And as you say, not just for those with chronic illness, but just in general, I think. Rest
Definitely.
is good.
Exactly, yeah. And it's such a toxic kind of perception that we have of rest, and it really needs to be changed. Just with what you were saying then about like guilt and self-care, I have a quote that I would like to read, if you don't mind your book being read out.
No, I'd love to hear something.
So there is a quote that really resonated with me, and I'm sure it would have resonated with Lydia as well, because we're talking a lot on the podcast about the fact that we were both brought up working class, and there's a lot of feelings of I can never say this word, scarcity.
Oh, yes,
Scarcity. Is it scarcity? Okay. But there's a lot of feelings of that, and it comes around, money, and there's a lot of kind of shame, like feelings of shame around, class and money and things like that. But there was something that you wrote in the book that was sort of in relation to Tomasz and the protagonists, their own upbringing and how that made them act within their relationship now. And I'm going to read it. Let's order in food, he said. I don't mind cooking. I've spent enough money today. I'll get it. It's Saturday. We don't need to cook. I was so thankful for his sureness in moments like this, a reminder that there was not always a vague moral debt to pay, that it was okay to shrug and sigh and say, I don't want to do anything, just as easily as he could say, we're fine, we can order in if we feel like it. We understood each other's anxieties around money, had both grown up with the tension born of scarcity, the looks between parents and the frustration and fights that only ever seemed to be about money, and which made us both feel, with the reductive purity of childhood reasoning, that our parents would have been 100% happy if they did not have to worry about money. Tomasz understood that I could never quite forgive myself for spending what seemed to be exorbitant amounts on my body and its health supplements, or herbs, or apparent fixes that were not absolutely essential, but which gave me at least a measure of hope or sense of control. I just thought that was so beautifully articulated, and like I said, it resonated with me, and I'm sure with Lydia, on those feelings and on that feeling of guilt around money and an upbringing, and how it kind of impacts you as an adult now. With the protagonist, she's not only battling this mindset of her upbringing and in relation to where she's at now, but she's also worrying about spending money on things that will actually help ease her pain right now. So it was just so interesting to me, that sort of pull within her. Could you tell us why you wanted to capture that?
Yes, I'm so glad you've read that part. You're the first readers to kind of pick up on that line. And I remember having that in there and thinking, oh, is this kind of, does that really like add anything or mean anything? But to me,
it really does.
I'm really glad that you mentioned it, because I feel like that there's a lot of truth to that from my own experience. Like my partner and I do have that understanding amongst ourselves that, we grew up with money being like a tension point in the household, and, you don't necessarily, know if there's enough money for things, particularly big things, and you have sort of guilt around spending. And as you say, it carries through into adult life when you just sort of have that association. And even when you might be going out for this breakfast that feels ridiculously expensive, there's always just like this little niggling thing going, like, oh, is this okay? Will this like have a bad impact in like next week or in a month or something? And so I was conscious in the book of around illness and its cost, like quite literally, the financially as well. And the narrator kind of mentions early on how she makes the decision to take out, we call it private health insurance in Australia, which you don't need to have, but you can have it, and it can mean that you can kind of pick the doctor that you go to for a surgery, for example. And I kind of had her have that choice, but feeling a bit uneasy about doing that. But then also, yeah, all of those, the costs that come with having an illness, but the narrator feeling, I guess she is in a position of privilege now that she can afford to go and maybe get like acupuncture or a massage or something. But how those things, even though I think the word massage is so associated, like we were saying before, with luxury and expense and expensive spas or something, whereas for her it does actually give her pain relief and might mean that she can sleep for a few nights, or it might mean she can go out and have more energy that week if she's had acupuncture or something like that. And so, yeah, that was something that I was very conscious of mentioning money, because I feel like it's such an easy thing for just to have a character kind of take it for granted that they've got it or not got it. And whereas around illness, it felt like, well, there are, certain things this narrator can do that others maybe are not able to do, because now she's, at university, she's got a stipend, she's able to get a massage here and there. But I think, yeah, for me, it was important because I know that that's not always the case for somebody with chronic illness, let alone being able to access, the care that they need. So, yeah, I feel like it's a really important part of it. And it's tied in with that complexity of resting and self-care, how self-care is even sort of something that seems to cost money these days, even if it's kind of going out to do something for yourself, or buying a product that might help you, and how that's not necessarily an option for everyone. So yeah, having that in there, I'm so glad you brought that up, as sort of a way of conveying those things that I was thinking about as I was writing. And I was very conscious of, how these various intersections of class and gender, and how they're all impacted, or how they all impact the chronic illness experience.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well that the sort of justification of, well, I have to justify having a massage. I have to justify
Yes.
doing this, going for a coffee with a friend. I have to, I have to justify the fact that I'm going to give myself an hour. But I have to
Absolutely.
make up for that by, doing 4 extra hours of work later,
No,
I
right. Yeah.
yeah,
I hear myself still doing that, actually. It's a massage because of this particular joint hurting, or it's because,
yeah.
this has been a big week. And it's kind of like, yeah, you're mapping it out and sort of making it seem like it has to be, there has to be a good cause and effect, or a good reason, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating subject, and it's a brilliant book. And I cannot tell you how glad I am that we got the chance to read
Thanks
this,
so much.
because it was just amazing. And like I said, I devoured it in about, I mean, how long did it take me, Hannah? Less than a night. Like
Yeah,
I was just
very
That makes
fast.
me so pleased to hear.
I literally couldn't stop, and I was desperate for Hannah to get to the end so we could talk about it, because it's just such a brilliant book. Before we let you go, I would just love to ask you, what are your literary influences, and can you tell us about them, please?
Yes, sure. This is when I always have a million people I want to say, and then I go, who should I mention?
Just pick a few.
Yeah. I feel like Rachel Cusk is a big one. I feel like I really like her kind of interior. I love the interior kind of novelist, I suppose. And W.G. Zabald, I read a lot of him when I was younger. And again, I think I'm so drawn to that like inner monologue kind of narrator that you really just kind of get absorbed in. And Jon Fosse, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, his beautiful books as well. I feel like they draw you in. There's his book Septology, which doesn't have like any full stops, and it's like this 800-page thing, is amazing because you get into the rhythm of it. I really love rhythm in books, and how it can draw you into a narrator's frame of mind. And I quite like that sort of lulling sort of sense of being drawn in. And I think, yeah, probably those three. And it makes me notice how much I love, yeah, quite interior narrators and monologues and that sort of thing, and that dreamlike dialogue and that sort of thing. And I can see how that definitely influences the way I think about writing and the books I like to read, but then also how I write myself. Yeah.
Amazing. And if you are going to read Jon Fosse, maybe don't start with Septology. Maybe start
Yeah.
with The Shining.
That's right. I think I recommended him earlier to someone, and I said maybe start with Alice at the Fire, and now
Yeah.
that's probably A Shining as well, because they're just nice little snippets, and you can get a taste of his style
Yeah.
rather than feel like
Before
you're
you
diving into the ocean.
before you take on 7 books in one.
Yeah, exactly. In
Listen.
Australia, they've come out, I think, in maybe here as well, in 3 separate
Yeah,
books
yes,
rather than
yes.
the big chunk. And I bought them as the 3 separate ones, which I quite like. It's easier to read on the train as well, but just also a bit more approachable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
I work in a bookstore, and whenever we get a new copy of like Septology in, it's in the bag because it's so heavy.
Yes, yeah,
Like, oh, here we
exactly.
go.
Well
Jon
done.
Fosse's here.
Yeah, for sure.
Last but not least, before we let you go, Catherine, we have to ask for a recommendation. So, do you have any cultural recommendations for us today?
Oh wow. Is that anything I've been
Anything
reading,
that
Anything,
you've been
film,
watching,
TV.
listening to, reading? It can be anything at all.
Oh wow. I feel like I've been going through they're not very niche recommendations because I feel
That's
like I'm
fine.
watching the like it's award season type
Mhm.
films. So I did recently watch Killers of the Flower Moon,
Mm,
which I did find with yeah, is it what's her name? Lily
Gladstone.
Gladstone. Yeah, I just blanked on her name. And yeah, I've found Lily Gladstone, and now I've watched a couple of other things that she's in, and I'm just realizing what a force she is. And I just felt that that film really really moved me. And I think coming from Australia, where we have a settler colony, where a lot of us are. We all live on stolen land. I live in Naarm, which is the traditional name for Melbourne, and it's the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And so I think for that film to have such an impact, kind of on I guess, awards and commercial
Mm.
kind of scale, to me felt really important and made me think a lot, I guess, as a white Australian living on that land. So yeah, not a particularly niche recommendation, but one that just has kind of been in my mind, and then I've been really pleased to sort of see Lily Gladstone's sort of success that she's having.
No, I mean, you've given me the push to watch it because I've not got round to that one yet.
The
So,
long one, my partner and I watched it in a couple of nights actually, because it was so long and
yeah.
I went to fall asleep in the films, but it was amazing. It was more That's just more me being a tired person. But yeah, it's a long one, but once you get into it, it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and I spoke to my friend who's a big cinema geek the other day, and he was like, I am 100% certain that she's getting like best actress at the
Yeah,
Oscars.
I
There's no
really,
way
really hope
that
she does. Yeah.
it would be amazing.
Yeah.
Catherine, thank you so much for joining us on A Pair of Bookends today. Where can our listeners find you on social media?
Yes, sure. So mostly on Instagram, and it's just my full name, Katherine Brabon. And
Perfect.
that's where I've been, posting my lovely UK trip and all my bookshop visits and all of the
Yay.
fun stuff, and what I'm reading and that sort of thing mostly. Yeah.
That's what we love. So I
Love.
will pop a link to that in the show notes. But as we said before, your book is out now in the UK and it is published by Ultimo Press, which I believe is also the Australian publisher as well.
Right. Yep. They have
Perfect.
Australia and the UK. Yeah.
Wonderful. And it's already out in Australia. It's published by Bloomsbury in the US. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, it's coming out in July actually, in the US. So that's another,
Sorry,
super
US
exciting thing
listeners.
to look forward to. Yeah, a few more months ahead.
But they can pre-order,
Exactly. Yeah, it's available.
which always helps novelists. So
Definitely.
let's do that. I will pop a link to those in the show notes for pre-orders and for our UK listeners who can get their copy straight away. As it's become obvious over the episode, we absolutely love this book and cannot recommend it enough. Go buy yourselves a copy. Go give Catherine a follow. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And that is all we've got time for. So thank you again, Katherine. It's been so lovely to chat to you today.
Thank you. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye.